Welcome. It's nice to see everyone here today. My name is Dr. Sue Weissmark. I am a professor, author, researcher, and president and founder of GWG Enterprises. Thank you for taking the time to participate in this activity today. We wanted to get you to start thinking about our objectives, which are, I'm going to be talking today about the psychological processes of the intergenerational transmission of justice. I know that's a mouthful, but promise by the end of this meeting, you'll know exactly what I mean by the intergenerational transmission of injustice. Then I'm going to examine the legacy of injustice and polarization. And then I will conclude the talk with differentiating between our science of diversity method and the more traditional diversity approaches. Most of what I'm going to be saying today can be found in my book, which was recently published from Oxford University Press, called The Science of Diversity. So what is justice? Usually we think of justice in legal terms, but my research has focused on the psychological aspects of injustice and how it is transmitted intergenerationally. We know from lots of research in psychology that humans have an inborn sense of what we call ought or justice. Our need for justice is the same need that we have for balance and closure. Psychologists have tried to understand this in terms of our perceptual processes, and research has found that our brains generate balance and closure. So we can conclude by saying that our sense of justice is a cognitive consistency motive or drive toward fairness and psychological balance. The psychological sense of justice describes situations in which we feel something ought to happen. It's fair. When there is no closure, when we feel that things are not fair, the research suggests that if an injustice is not rebalanced between people, this imbalance and sense of injustice is passed down to their descendants. Can we really inherit injustice? That was the research question I examined in a groundbreaking study that examined this. The study brought together descendants of Nazis and descendants of Holocaust survivors, and it was in all the major dailies, in the New York Times, in the Frankfurt papers in Germany, and the Harvard Gazette, and so forth. We brought these groups together to see what happens when you bring together descendants of an opposing historical injustice. It was also made into movies, and at the end you can see all the links to these meetings called The Journey to Understanding, Seeing the Other Side, The Past Between Them. We know from this study that I conducted, bringing together descendants of slaves, later on and slave owners, which replicated the study between descendants of Holocaust survivors and Nazis, is that an historical injustice is very complex, and it understands, and it needs to be understood also from a psychological point of view. So there is an intergenerational process of ethnic identifications, and descendants of an injustice feel, even though they were not involved in the injustice, because this is generations later, a need to rebalance the past. I just mentioned that we replicated the study with the descendants of slaves and slave owners, and that also was in all the major newspapers, and a movie was made of that. You can check all this out on YouTube. It was called Coming to the Table. The articles were called Project Yale's Taste of King Dream, Slaves to the Past, An Overdue Apology, Lancing the Past, all getting at the essence of these meetings that we had, which was, how do you understand the impact of an injustice like slavery several generations later? When we brought these groups together, it was the first time ever that descendants of slave owners and descendants of slaves came together to talk. They began to share their family stories, and it was very obvious right away that there was a lot of unfinished business many generations later. Many white participants had limited information of their family's role in slavery, where many of the Black participants, by contrast, had much more knowledge of their descendants' experiences as slave. Both sides, though they felt it impacted the past of slavery, impacted them, the events impacted them differently. They both felt that they inherited a defining legacy. Parents' experience influenced their identification with their ethnic groups, whether that was being Black or white. And they both felt that the aftermath of slavery has had a major impact on them and on the country. However, their views about the past were polarized, and here you could see it. So, for example, one descendant of slave owner at the meeting said, well, slavery was legal. I'm not saying it was right, but it was legal. Immediately, a descendant of a slave at the meeting said, okay, it was legal, but who made the law? And a descendant of slave owner said, there was a genuine relationship of trust between master and slave. And a descendant of slaves said, okay, my descendant was treated by his master like a pet that he liked, yet had to sleep at the foot of his bed. These are quotes. So you can, this is just a brief example of how an historic injustice many generations later leads to polarized views about the same event. Descendant of slave owner went on to say, I resent being held responsible for something my ancestors did, and I'm constantly having to apologize to Black people. The descendant of slaves, by contrast, said, I resent the country has never apologized. What we saw from these meetings, both with the descendants of Nazis and descendants of Holocaust survivors and descendants of slaves and slave owners, was that, in fact, the injustice did not go away and it persisted. And we can see that in the United States today. We've made progress, but there are many unresolved feelings of injustice on both sides. Unlike the meeting that brought together the descendants of Holocaust survivors and Nazis, I want to point out that descendant of slave and slave owner meeting, an apology was made by some white participants. And there seemed to be a sense of guilt and responsibility felt by some of the white participants. Some descendants of slave owners felt a responsibility to personally make amends. Whether it was enough, whether that led to reconciliation, I can't say for sure. There was progress. I think some of these pictures here can show you it was a very intense, emotional meeting. This legacy of injustice and polarization, which I've tried to outline here today, applies not only to these historic injustices, these terrible historic injustices like the Holocaust legacy or the slavery legacy, but we also can see legacies of injustice and polarization between many groups in the United States and globally. Religious groups such as Catholics and Protestants, Hindus and Muslims, political groups like Democrats and Republicans, more religious groups like Christians and Jews, between immigrants and natural-born citizens, and then, of course, we see today between liberals and conservatives and heterosexuals and gay communities. So there are many, many groups to which this legacy of injustice and polarization applies. In the US, affirmative action was a legal effort in the US that tried to rectify this injustice of discrimination to minority groups. Many of you probably are aware that in the 1970s, the concept, however, of reverse racism emerged, and it arose in direct response to affirmative and race-based policy. What reverse racism means is that there seemed to be white resentment, and there was a backlash against the US attempt to rectify this injustice. Many white people resented and felt that minority people were viewed as the favored citizen of the state and that white people were now cast aside. I point this out because, as you can see, simple solutions don't always work, especially if we forget the psychological underpinnings of how injustice impacts people. So after 50 years of research, we can say with a good degree of confidence that the research suggests that mandatory institutional diversity training efforts that are mostly focused on legislation and compliance as opposed to psychological aspects may have unintended consequences. It's sort of a force feeding, and it can actually trigger bias rather than stamp it out. Researchers have found that people often rebel against rules and prefer to assert their autonomy. They don't want to be told what they should do, so to speak. Furthermore, the research suggests that simple discussions on polarizing topics like affirmative action or slavery, we just had groups discuss that, can actually increase polarization because people tend to have very strong emotional response that can be very polarizing. So these traditional diversity approaches that often we see in institutions and organizations, expecting people to feel differently, think differently, and do all of the above in 10 minutes, are not likely to be very successful. The approach that we use when teaching about diversity and polarization is the approach called the science of diversity method. The data show that this method is effective for facilitating conversations on polarizing topics because the facilitators are mindful of how resentment and a sense of injustice felt by all involved flows from unreconciled past injustices. Biases, therefore, cannot simply be ordered away. When people are made to feel ashamed or they're blamed for their so-called bad behaviors, they might, in fact, lose their desire to change and engage with the other side. So the shame and blame type of diversity training programs ignore everything that social scientists know about our biological need to maintain our individual identities and our preferences for people who are like us. What's very unique about the science of diversity approach, and I'm underlining this, is that it does not promote an agenda. You know, many people who consult on diversity and inclusion have an agenda. Sometimes it's overt, often it's hidden. They want to seek often to prove the importance of diversity and or some point about outlawing biases. And so conversations on diversity often end up being debates, arguments, and politicized. By contrast, the science of diversity method is designed to facilitate conversations on polarizing issues. And to do this, we have to understand the role of justice and injustice in people's lives. My final comment to wrap this up is to point out that it is a universal truth. It's a fact of life that diversity is a feature of nature. This is true literally of nature. Look out your windows, you'll see different flowers, different trees. It's also true of individuals, families, social classes, religious groups, ethnic groups. So we cannot simply order away our diverse viewpoints, our diverse identities, and our biases. It will not work. The scientific method is a fair-minded and a balanced way to manage diverse viewpoints and to foster meaningful conversations. Thank you all for your attention. Before we wrap up, we invite you to please take a moment to reflect silently on how your identity may have influenced how your organization approaches diversity training and management.